Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Mike, and today we're going to talk about some things that I hear over and over again from foreigners, many of which have never set foot in the Philippines. They were Americans that I knew back in the United States who thought that they knew everything that there was to know about the Philippines. They had their share of stereotypes and misconceptions about this country. So today I'm going to do a little myth busting. But before we get into this topic, if you're not already subscribed, please do so. Give this video the old thumbs up and share my videos. Also, don't forget about that bell notification. Okay, we're going to get this video started. Okay, myth number one, and that is this. If you ever get into a legal dispute with a Filipino, don't bother fighting it, because the police, the courts, the barangay, or the Philippine government are automatically going to side with the Filipino. You've probably heard that one before. Some foreigners will tell you, you're a foreigner. You're never going to win against a Filipino. Foreigners have told me that speaking to me face to face. Plus, I've read similar messages all over social media, more times than I can count. But is that actually true? Well, the answer is a little bit more complicated than simply saying yes or no. There are situations where a foreigner can absolutely find himself at a disadvantage in a dispute with a Filipino. But the idea that the Philippine law automatically says Filipino wins because he's Filipino is a myth. The Philippine Constitution provides important legal protections and due process, and Philippine courts don't have a rule saying that a Filipino automatically wins a case simply because the other party is a foreigner. In fact, the Constitution's Bill of Rights contains protections for persons not simply Philippine citizens. But, and this is a very important but, that doesn't mean foreigners should assume that the Philippine legal system works exactly like the legal system back in their home country. And this is where a lot of confusion begins. Imagine an American living in Cebu gets into a serious legal dispute with a Filipino business partner. The Filipino has lived in the community his whole life. His family lives nearby. He knows people. He speaks the local language. He understands how the barangay works. He knows where to go, who to talk to, and what documents are required. The American may have none of those advantages, not knowing what to do. That doesn't necessarily mean that the government is discriminating against him. It may simply mean that the Filipino understands the local system better. And that's a huge difference. Myth number two, the police. Another thing foreigners sometimes misunderstand is the role of the police. Police officers aren't supposed to decide who ultimately wins a civil dispute. If the two people have a disagreement over money, a contract, property, or some other matter, the police aren't necessarily the people who determine who's right and who's wrong. If a criminal allegation is involved, the government still has to establish the elements of the offense under Philippine law. So if you hear somebody say the police will always take the Filipino side, I would be very careful about accepting that statement as fact. Could an individual police officer be unfair? Of course. Could corruption or favoritism happen? That's also a possibility. The Philippines isn't some magical country where corruption and personal connections don't exist. But neither is it accurate to conclude that every negative experience a foreigner has with the Philippine authorities is automatically caused by anti-foreigner discrimination. Sometimes the foreigner simply doesn't understand the legal system. The next myth is about kuwarta. Kuwarta is the Bisaya word for money. And that brings me to one of the biggest myths that foreigners have about living here. If I have money, I have power. Not necessarily. Having money can certainly make some things easier, but being wealthy doesn't give the foreigner the right to ignore Philippine laws. In fact, one of the most important things foreigners need to remember is that when you're living here in the Philippines, you're under Philippine law. The Bureau of Immigration specifically describes itself as responsible for ensuring that foreigners within Philippine jurisdiction comply with Philippine laws, and it has authority concerning entry, stay, departure, immigration violations, and deportation proceedings. So having a retirement income, owning a business, or having a large bank account doesn't mean that you're above the law. Okay, myth number 4. If I have a visa, I can stay forever. Not necessarily. What I've been told regarding the tourist visa is that you have to leave the country for a week every 5 years. An SRRV visa allows you to stay in the Philippines for as long as you want, and you can come and go as much as you want to. What you don't want to do is listen to some guy at a bar who tells you, "Don't worry about your visa. I've been here for 10 years and nobody cares." That's not legal advice. That's bad advice. Myth number 5. Because I'm an American, I have the same rights here that I have in America. This is another big one. You don't. You do have rights under Philippine law, but those rights aren't necessarily identical to the rights that you have in the United States. You're a guest or resident, depending on your immigration status, in another sovereign country. For example, foreigners don't have the same political rights as Philippine citizens. The Philippine Constitution specifically provides that suffrage is exercised by citizens of the Philippines. You simply can't say, "I'm an American taxpayer, therefore I should be able to vote in Philippine elections." That's not how it works. Myth number 6. If I marry a Filipina, I automatically become a Filipino citizen. No, marriage to a Filipino does not automatically transform a foreign citizen into a Philippine citizen. There are immigration and citizenship procedures, and the Bureau of Immigration specifically provides information concerning permanent residency based on marriage to a Philippine citizen. Marriage can provide certain immigration opportunities, but don't confuse immigration status with citizenship. Here's another myth that gets foreigners into trouble. Myth number 7. If I'm married to a Filipina, I can own land because my wife is Filipino. Be extremely careful with this one. Philippine law places significant restrictions on foreign ownership of private land. The Constitution generally limits land ownership to those legally qualified to acquire land under Philippine law, with specific exceptions. And this is one area where you absolutely should not rely on something you heard from another foreigner at a coffee shop. If you're considering a property transaction involving substantial money, talk to a qualified Philippine attorney. Myth number 8. A foreigner can open any business that he wants. Again, not necessarily. The Philippines has rules governing foreign investment and foreign participation in certain industries. Some activities have restrictions on foreign ownership, while other businesses can have much greater foreign participation depending on the circumstances. The Board of Investments maintains the foreign business negative list and explains the sectors where restrictions can apply. So before you put $50,000, $100,000, or $200,000 into a Philippine business, don't just trust the Filipino girlfriend, the friend of a friend, or another foreigner who says, "Everybody does it this way." Get professional advice. And here's another myth I hear all the time. Myth number 9. All Filipinos are trying to scam foreigners. Absolutely not. There are honest Filipinos, dishonest Filipinos, generous Filipinos, selfish Filipinos, hardworking Filipinos, lazy Filipinos, trustworthy Filipinos, and untrustworthy Filipinos. In other words, they're people. The same thing applies to foreigners. There are wonderful foreigners living here, and there are foreigners who come here and cause problems. So don't make the mistake of judging an entire country based on what you heard from your friend. Now let's get back to the original question. Will Philippine authorities automatically side with a Filipino in a dispute with a foreigner? I would say no. But should you assume that everything will automatically work out in your favor because you're a foreigner? Absolutely not. You need to understand the law, understand the culture, document your transactions, keep your receipts, preserve messages and contracts, and remain calm when dealing with authorities. And perhaps most importantly, don't turn a legal dispute into a personal war. I've seen foreigners make the mistake of becoming angry, loud, insulting, or threatening because they believe they're being treated unfairly. That can make a bad situation even worse. Remember, you're not in the United States anymore. You're in the Philippines. You chose to come here. And if you're going to live here, you need to respect Philippine law, Philippine institutions, Philippine culture, and the people who live here. That doesn't mean you have to agree with everything. It doesn't mean that you have to give up your legal rights. And it certainly doesn't mean that you should allow someone to take advantage of you. It means that you need to understand the environment that you're living in. So here's my advice to foreigners. Don't believe the extreme stories that you hear online. Don't believe the guy who says foreigners have no rights here. And don't believe the opposite guy who says, don't worry about anything because you're an American. Both are wrong. The reality is somewhere in the middle. You have legal protections, but you also have legal responsibilities. You can seek justice, but you need evidence. You can challenge something that you believe is wrong, but you need to follow the proper procedures. And if you're involved in something serious, especially a criminal accusation, major financial dispute, land transaction, immigration matter, or business dispute, don't try to be your own lawyer. Hire a qualified Philippine attorney, because the best way to protect yourself in the Philippines isn't to constantly assume that everybody is against you. It's to know the rules, follow the rules, keep good records, and use the legal system properly when you need it. And that's probably a much better strategy than spending your time on Facebook groups and YouTube comments listening to foreigners tell you that the Filipino always wins. Because sometimes the Filipino wins, sometimes the foreigner wins, and sometimes nobody wins because both sides spend years and a lot of money fighting over something that could have been prevented with a good contract in the first place. And that's the reality of living in another country. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. God bless, peace out, and I'll catch you in the next video.